Okay, thank you for having me. Microphone's on good.
Bring it close to your mouth, as close as you can get it.
We all set? Great. So again, thanks for having me. I think this is a really important conversation. I think to get started, I guess as a political scientist, try to provide some context for what we just saw happen in this past election. Usually, midterm elections, we get 37 to 40% of the voting age population turn out to vote, which is obviously not ideal. But even on presidential elections, we only get about 60%, which is also, when we think about the United States in comparison to other nations, not ideal. But this election, we had about 50% of the voting age population turn out to vote, which is the highest percent of the overall population to vote since 1914. And I mean, for historians in the room, 1914 was also a very important year and time period for the United States, because much of what we see today, these battles that are happening within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, a progressive movement that's really growing, was happening at this time as well. So in some ways, there's some parallels there. And this election was the first time that we had over 100 million people vote in a midterm election in our history. So there's that's for context, right? And so what does that mean for our elections? Clearly, although election day and the day after, people were questioning whether it was a blue wave or not. It was clearly a blue wave, right? So Democrats gained 39 seats and the House potentially 40 seats, so gaining the majority there. Came close to the Senate, still up to, for debate today. This is important elect. There's an important election happening in Mississippi to find out really what's the majority going to be for the Republicans. But even there, you had a Democrat win in Arizona. Democrat come really close to winning in Texas, which a year ago would have been impossible to imagine. Democrat coming close to winning in Florida. Who knows what will happen today? But even the conversation of a Democrat potentially winning in Mississippi just would have been imaginable. So at the national level, there's changes coming, right? So here, the Democrats gaining control of the House means that at least for education, there's going to be some oversight now that just hasn't existed over the past 2 years. Not just, obviously, we can think about many more topics beyond education, but since we're here for education, there's going to be a type of oversight of the Department of Education that just hasn't existed. So on questions of civil rights and things like that many of us have been concerned about, at least now there's an institutional mechanism to provide the public a space to talk about this and investigate, right? But for all of the energy and discussion that's been happening at the national level as a result of this election, really the action is at the state level. And I suspect that much of the conversation we're going to have today is at the state level. And there was also some significant gains for Democrats, right? So Democrats gained 7 seats, governorships across the country. There were a net gain of, I think, it was a little bit over 350 Democrats at the state legislature level, which is significant given the decline of Democrats over time, particularly under the Obama administration. And why is this important, right? So I'm talking about the Democrats, the gains. Why is this important? I think there's several reasons to put this in perspective. It signals, still the jury's out, but it signals that the conservative movement that we've seen at the state level, which emerges out in the 1970s, and I talk about this in my book on takeovers, that really had an effect that just up till now, I would argue, really had a transformative effect on public education. It may signal the end of this, right? Because, and this is for a number of reasons. Number one, the Democrats forgot about state governance and state power in the 1960s and 1970s, primarily because of their concentration on the national level and the local level. And there's many good reasons for this, right? But what that resulted in was not enough emphasis on what was happening at the state level. And in that vacuum, conservatives were able to grow their power. Conservative political organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute were able to gain a lot of influence over state governance over this period of time. And so by Democrats not being really part of this conversation, really gave an opportunity for these types of organizations to really gain a footing. At the same time, there was also an internal battle happening within the Democratic Party by the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, I should say, and where the Democrats who favored a certain type of public education, or one would argue not really much of a public education, really won, right? So the Bill Clintons of the world, they're the ones that win. Even, you can make the argument about the Barack Obamas and so forth, the Cory Bookers, and I'm from New Jersey, so Cory Booker is going to be a part of my conversation. They're able to really gain a footing within the Democratic Party. But that's not to say that there weren't elements within the Democratic Party who were fighting against that. They were just overwhelmed, particularly throughout the 1990s and 2000s. And so if you're interested in public education, and so I should say this, we're in an audience here, but I suspect that an audience that's very much for the type of conversation we're having here today. But what I mean by this public education is an emphasis on really reinserting the public in education. And so what does that mean? That teachers have a say in what's happening, that parents have a say in what's happening, school boards, city councils, mayors, community organizations, that they have an opportunity to influence schooling in ways that we haven't seen over a long period of time. And so why this is important and why it's important to think about the Democrats in this context is because for the first time in many years, the Democratic Party is regaining momentum, regaining power at the state level, and that is all a result of what's happening at the school level and school mobilization. And so that the teachers, the movement that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years for education, they have been the ones that have propelled these Democrats, which now forces a very different conversation within the Democratic Party. The day of embracing a type of attitude, approach to education that separates community from schooling is hopefully, I think it signals the end of that type of approach. And so we'll see what goes forward. And I just want to cite some examples of how this translates into real everyday politics and policy making. So again, I'm from New Jersey, I'm in Newark. We see the emergence of Ras Baraka gets elected mayor of Newark, and he gets elected because of his platform on public education. And that was at the center of his campaign for mayor of Newark. He gets elected, and there is community mobilization led by teachers, led by students, to regain local control of a school district that had been under state control for over 20 years, right? And once he gets elected, he then has a certain type of agenda that whoever was going to run for governor in the Democratic Party had to pay attention to. And eventually what you get is a Governor Murphy who is an ally of Ras Baraka on many issues, including education. And so, yes, there was a movement for a long period of time to increase the number of charter schools in Newark, and they were pretty successful at that. But at the very least now, there is a resistance to the expansion of charter schools because of that relationship that exists between Ras Baraka and Governor Murphy. And going forward, so that's just a potential example of the type of mobilization and energy that I would argue is much needed, and it signals that it might be happening now. One other example I mentioned before, I stop here, is in Chicago. And so a co-author of mine, Sally Nwama, who's at Duke University and does great work on education, she wrote a piece that I suspect many of you may have read on the Washington Post, which argues that it was Rahm Emanuel's school closure policies which forced him not to seek re-election in Chicago. That he alienated the African American community in Chicago, and that basically made him not a viable candidate for mayor anymore. And so again, here's an example of school politics having an effect on city politics, and that will in turn, I would argue, have significant effects on statewide politics. And so So I think that there's a lot here that we need to unpack and think about, but I think at the very least, this past election signaled what I think would be, and I think Michael will probably disagree on much of what I'm saying here, but at the very least, you know, there's something different happening here. So, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Mike, I would love to hear where you disagree and agree, but also you've written recently that you think we're going through a tough patch for education reform, and I'd love to hear how you think this recent midterms impact that and the trajectory that you see going forward.